Welcome to the Equal Opportunities Committee, the third meeting of 2014. Can you please set any electronic devices to flight mode or off, please? We'll come to the usual introductions in a moment after the first agenda item, which is a decision on taking business in private. Members are asked to agree to take items 3 and 4 in private. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. The second agenda is an evidence session on looking at the work of the advisory group on tackling sectarianism in Scotland. We'll start the session with some introductions. At the table we have our clerking and research team, official reporters and broadcasting services. And around the room we are supported by the Security Office and also welcome observers in the public gallery. My name is Margaret McCulloch and I'm the committee's convener, and I now invite members and witnesses to introduce themselves in turn, starting here on my right. And can I also ask the witnesses, when they're introducing themselves, if they would like to actually make an opening statement at the same time, please. Thank you.
I'm Marco Biaggi. I'm the MSP for Edinburgh Central and Deputy Convener of the committee.
Morning, John Finney, MSP Highlands and Islands.
Hi, I'm Siobhan McMahon, MSP Central Scotland.
John Mason, MSP for Glasgow Shettleston.
Alec Johnston, member from North East Scotland.
Good morning, Christian Allard, MSP for the North East Scotland.
Good morning, Michael Rosey, University of Edinburgh.
And I'm Duncan Morrow, University of Ulster, but I've been the chair of the committee.
Okay. Would any of you like to make an opening statement at all?
If it's helpful to the committee, yes, I'm happy to. If you'd rather start with questions, I'm also happy. But if you'd like just an opening statement, just to give some sense of it. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for inviting us to this session. I suppose it's always important for us to see that what you do is kind of being taken seriously and looked at. So thank you very much for asking for this. We have been working since effectively September last year on this issue, and I suppose that we were established by the Minister for Community Safety and Legal Affairs to look into this question. And I suppose the particular issue we were looking at was how could we address this issue in a way which took it out from the megaphone or the silence and actually dealt with it as a community-based issue and tried to find some more effective ways to begin to deal with what we think is probably a long-term rather than an acute question in Scotland, but something which needs to have a specific local and proper response that is real for people in real circumstances. Our remit, I suppose, that we took was to do some work. There was an awful lot of talk around sectarianism, was to really try to work out with people what are we actually talking about now, since in many ways it's one of those themes which everybody seems to have a view about, where we felt the evidence base wasn't really strong enough. Second of all, to establish that evidence base, and where was it and how would we best deal with it then, were the three very basic questions we tried to look at. And to answer those questions we took broadly a three-pronged approach. In the first instance we were asked to look at the research base, so we have really tried to ensure that in the future there is more evidence both at a quantitative and at a qualitative level. So that's been something that we've been working with the Scottish Government to try to see what might be a useful research agenda going forward, to try to get some real shape around this both at a qualitative and a quantitative level. The second then was to give advice on practice, was that in many ways we felt that this is experienced as a human issue, so can we through the budget that the Scottish Government made available actually try to improve the knowledge base and the practice base of people in real circumstances, and we've given advice on the distribution of those resources as they've come forward, and the Minister has largely taken that advice, but it has been a question of trying to ensure that this is more broadly spread than just one or two organisations, and actually to create alongside that what might be called a learning framework, actually to try to gather all of that together. So we've been trying to encourage conversation between all of those groups around what they're learning and what they're developing, so that that can have a long-term lasting legacy. That includes, by the way, stuff online and things which people can actually build a hub, a knowledge hub around this kind of work. And then the third was essentially to take evidence from people who have been actively engaged in this topic, and that was really the time-consuming part of our work, was trying to talk with what might be called all stakeholders across Scotland within the time that we had. And we had some very important discussions with people in all sorts of walks of life, which convinced us that there was an issue that this issue had changed over time. There was also an appetite for it to be not an issue, generally, that people were broadly trying to see how could this be taken off the table rather than trying to reinforce it. But that in some ways there was I would characterise two fears. One is that by naming it, you actually make it real, and that you do something which is slowly going away, you actually make things worse. And the other one was that we're not taking it seriously enough, that it's a much more serious and significant issue than people want to take seriously, and that it's being hidden and pushed under the carpet. So our view was that it had to be neither of those, that we need to take this out of the fear box and turn this into something which is dealt with as a matter of fact. We try to put some policy around it, we try to get people to step up to the plate, and we turn it into something which can be dealt with. And it is our view that most people in Scotland, if they could, would like to do that now, would like to actually take the steps which makes this something which is no longer this kind of ghost at the feast. I suppose I will just say one or two things and then we can take it from questions, because I think you have the report in front of you. But the kind of soundbite that we have ended up using is saying that the sectarianism, where does it matter? And the soundbite is when it's about glass bottles, in other words, when it's about violence and when it's about intimidation and threat, and people feel that there's a genuine issue. If and when it's about glass ceilings and where it operates, that there's things where people feel that they can't, or there's cold houses for certain people in certain parts of society, and that doesn't work. And then the third, which we called glass curtains, which is that there are communities which exist in a kind of isolation from each other and talk inside themselves, where we're not getting the benefit of the social cohesion that would be there if there was greater interaction, and it creates ignorance and prejudice and so on, which acts its way out in particularly seems to be schools and young people and so on. So what could we do about that? So those were the kind of core issues. We did find an appetite for change. We came to the view that the issues around this are around leadership, around practically trying to get some colour onto this, getting the research base right, and we did not come to the view that this would be primarily driven by legislation at this point. So I think that's probably everything. Is there anything else you think I should say?
Just that we've been met actually with generosity through all the stakeholders, that people have been, I think what has been really refreshing is the people who've talked to us have been very open about it. They've had very different views often. But certainly we've had lots of cooperation from very key stakeholders, particularly in this place, in this Parliament, where we've had very good and very positive cross-party support, which is very much, as an independent group, we need that. And we hope that that can continue. But that's been very, very encouraging. The evidence base, I think, is absolutely crucial, that we move this from a thing that everyone knows but doesn't quite know how to pin it down, to actually say, well, when and where and how is this thing important, and when and where and how does this thing impact on people's lives, and how can we make that better? And a key part of that, I think, has been almost the work that we've done around the formal work of the group, which has often been working with some of the funded organisations to think about ways that their own work can be evaluated and feed in to the research base. So, there's money being invested in community work that I think then can also help us understand more broadly in
what's going on.
Yeah, what's going on. So that's been quite an exciting thing. It's not formally in the report, but there's been lots of activities around that. And also, thank you for inviting us.
Oh, no, thank you for coming. That's really interesting what you've been saying. We'll go over to the questions now, and John Finney would like to ask the sort of first questions.
Thank you. Good morning, gentlemen. Thanks very much for the report. Thanks for coming along. I enjoyed reading it. My question you've largely answered, and it was about the evidence base and the view that the group had that it was insufficient. I found it interesting you used the term evidence agenda and talk about quality and quantitative. Can you maybe just expand a bit more on that? How, for instance, that would be drawn and perhaps feed into any future action plans, please?
Well, I'll say some words and then Michael can come in on this. Basically, in some senses, there is a quantitative issue of, what can people access, what can people do, is this a real issue? In some ways, a lot of this is in the fabric of community life. It's in what actually happens, how people live, how people experience their day-to-day life. And what we wanted to do was, I suppose, at one level track this, put this back into the questions, make sure that it's asked rather than not asked, so that it's in the attitude surveys, questions are put into the omnibus surveys, there are questions across the board, and we'll be able to track whether this is a changing reality for people. Because in some ways, the avoidance culture around this has been largely driven by it's best left on its own. I think if we have a message, it is we now think actually we don't have to be so frightened of it. It should be one of those things which we can actually name, address and then tackle, and that's actually the only way forward here. And one of those is to really say, what is the actual size and shape of that? So the two, and I suppose Michael's added a third, the two formal evidence tracks that we've taken are, as I say, to insert a set of questions around the quantitative measuring that is done of attitudes and people's experiences across the board where that's possible. And the second, and we've done that in a number of cases, and the second is to identify a number of research projects. One that is going to report is how parades impact on local communities and what the consequences, both for those who are participating and those who are in areas where they're happening, and what are the short-term and the long-term impacts on relationships. How does that actually work? And Stirling University have got that contract. We have a number of issues around gender. We're quite interested in looking at the way the internet functions in this, because there is very clear evidence that that's become an open space where people throw things, allegations and things at each other with some impact, and we are trying to make sure that we understand what it is we're talking about before we take action, and hopefully that will feed into anything which people think is a useful thing to do. The third thing then, of course, is that a lot of evidence is coming back to us from practitioners of what they're finding for young people. And some of that is, how do you turn what might look like anecdote into something serious? That is, that kids in the playground tell you this is something which actually matters. This is at a very deep root of identity formation, where people are getting shouted at when they're 8-year-old at the bus stop, or they don't share those kind of things. How does that turn into evidence of how people live together? So we're trying to make pathways so that because it is important before you do something to know what it is you're talking about, and that, I suppose, is our key. Do you want to say?
I think there's always a risk when you start a sort of discussion with academics by starting with the research that my answer is going to be we need lots more of it, and please throw money at academia to do it. In a sense, we came into this with, in some respects, a very good research base. I mean, the census of 2001, for example, gave us quite a good research base on, if you like, life chances by religious groups, so that we could, for the first time, look across Scotland and look at educational attainment, occupation, where people's housing, etc. But what we don't really have, where we are really particularly weak, and I think this is important for the matter of sectarianism, is people's attitudes and perceptions. So it's not necessarily life chances or outcomes, it's about how people sort of live their everyday lives. And quantitative methods, and I'm a quantitative by background, are not well suited to do that. So one of the things we sort of recognised was we need to try and get at the more everyday, in some ways the mundane things in life, which actually can matter very much. One of the things that the existing evidence does suggest is there may be a difference between how people perceive sectarianism as a problem and how they experience it themselves. And that's something I think we need to get at, because there might be an issue here about reassuring the public that Scotland is not, or Scotland is not necessarily the way that they worry about it. I always think of a sort of comparison with fear of crime. And I think about my parents who live in a very low crime area but are very worried about crime. And in some ways, I think sectarianism may be a worry that some groups have, some groups in particular may have in certain places. So evidence is the way to try and reassure people that sectarianism is not everywhere at all times, but it is in some places at some times. And quantitative approaches are not necessarily good at getting that. So we have, as Duncan said, we've commissioned Stirling University, who will report this summer about the impact on local communities of parades, not just Orange and Republican parades, but parades that may not have any sort of direct relevance with the sectarian issue. And we're currently looking at tenders on the community impact, a qualitative study in communities of the impact of sectarianism, which hopefully will tease out when and where and how and to whom this actually occurs. So there's, sorry, ask an academic about research and you won't get a short answer, but I think it's important to be evidence-based as much as possible. And certainly one of the key things is we're trying to move towards a wider and deeper and richer sort of range of evidence that policymakers can actually look at.
Well, my questions will evidence I'm not an academic, but I would like to maybe... It was interesting when you mentioned the census, because of course the frequency of that may impact on your ability to do research. Also the increasing number of people who, for instance, no longer designate themselves as being identified with a specific religion or faith. And can you just help me to the extent that, and perhaps I should know this, that, for instance, perception and views can constitute evidence? Because clearly they must. But perceptions in particular, and the example you give of the fear of crime, is...
Well, I mean, absolutely. Perceptions can be crucial because it can impact on how people live their lives. If you're worried that going down a certain street or going into a particular pub or a club is going to impact on you, even if it wouldn't, you're not going to go in there. So absolutely, perceptions are crucial and a crucial part of the evidence. On the non-religious, I guess part of my role in the group is to keep putting my hand up and saying, what about people who don't fall easily into some of the formulations? And certainly the census is suggesting that more and more people in Scotland are not assigning themselves a label, certainly in this way. I think they're an important group, and a formulation that, I mean, you're an Equal Opportunities Committee, so you'll understand this far better than I have, but I've routinely heard in equalities work the formulation all faiths and none. But in practice, the and none, I think, quite often gets sort of pushed to the side a little bit, and I think that's going to become more and more important, that we appreciate that there is a very wide range of beliefs and positions around religion in Scotland. And going forward, I think we have to recognise the rights of all those kind of groups to be involved. This doesn't fall as part of our group's remit, but certainly you can see continuing and emerging some tensions between what we might call the secular parts of our society, or those who don't have strong beliefs, and those who do. And I think that is an area that we as a society need to pay attention to, that people are able to express their views on religion, whether they're religious views or irreligious views, without necessarily being worried about causing conflict.
I think additionally, and it is entirely additional to that, is part of the problem in tackling sectarianism is that it can't be separated from religious roots, and it can't be separated from religious institutions. But things have grown out of that whose religious roots have become weaker over time, where the same kind of relationships and the same kind of consequences continue to structure things. So that actually, in terms of when we came to the definition, is what we were trying to grasp at here, is there is something here which religion plays a role, which churches have played a role historically, and their relationships are very important, and you can't distinguish that. And we've been very clear about that. On the other side of that, there are institutions which were built along those lines, where the requirement to believe has withered, but the sense of identity has been maintained, and where actually there is considerable evidence that people still draw on slogans and assumptions and a whole set of rituals around that. And in tackling sectarianism in a meaningful way, we have to find something which deals with all of that, which is that there's, as the Police Scotland told us, a permissive environment sometimes around hostility and aggression, which works its way out on people. And actually the thing we're trying to get at is to eliminate any permissive environment around that kind of hostility, or anything that would look like discrimination or look like antagonism. And it's at some deep level that has to go in order for there to be some sense in real life that it's something of the past, and we can talk about it as history rather than talk about it as real life. And just to be finally clear, is it was absolutely not our goal to eliminate difference. It was our goal to eliminate hostility, and that is something which we have been it's a thin line, and some people very quickly think that you're trying to get rid of difference. It's not at all what it's about. In fact, it's actually to rescue difference from hostility. It's what we're trying to do here, so that the kind of pluralism of Scotland is allowed, but it is in the context of people understanding that this contribution can be made without it being a negative one.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Siobhan.
Thank you. A section of the report I was particularly interested in was what is not sectarianism, and I think that's something we'll return to later, but specifically about the census, you talk about what anti-Irish prejudice is. So in the census, is it important to have those, as I would call them, invisible minorities, so the Irish community, the Polish community, the Italians, identified in any census going forward? Clearly, we've had progress in the UK census, but our own local census, I suppose, should it be included? Because, as we've just identified, not many people may identify themselves with a religion, but they may find themselves in one of those ethnic minority groups. So how important is that?
Well, most people in Scotland in the census did identify with religion. I think 65, off the top of my head, about 2/3 did identify with religion. When you're asking an academic interested in issues of national, religious and ethnic belonging, what should be in the census, I'd like as many questions as is possible. I think it is important. You know, we would all recognise that Scotland has been made up by recurrent in-migrations throughout its history. You know, absolutely, and therefore there are many ways to belong in Scotland. That one can be Irish and British and Scottish and European, etc. At the same time, and certainly that's an area of work that I'm very interested in. I would hope that the census will continue in a comprehensive form in Scotland, and I would hope that it would ask questions about ethnic belonging that would include whether people regard themselves as Polish or Irish or Indian or Pakistani or whatever, but also to allow them to be multiple belonging. It shouldn't be a tick one box, it should be tick as many boxes as is relevant.
As in all of these issues, the balance to be struck is between a monitoring which allows us to be serious about real issues there, and a labelling which puts people into this kind of forced kind of straitjacket which they don't want. And I suppose it is important in constructing the census that we think about that in the construction of the census. If we think there are potential issues which need to be dug up, and certainly from the Equal Opportunities Committee position, you'll be the people who would be aware of the things that are arriving on your desk. Those questions need to be asked. I think also part of the question is trying to, we said, that section on what it is not was really trying to say there are grey areas here where things shade into things. We said it's not anti-Catholicism. Yeah, that's not the same thing as saying anti-Catholicism and sectarianism don't have a really big overlap. They do. It's not anti-Irishness. That's not to say there isn't an anti-Irish dimension in sectarianism, which, if you weren't serious about it either. So it's this very slightly complicated thing of trying to, it's not aggressive, big, overt bigotry. It can be a very silent, quiet, discriminatory thing. And I think there was stuff last week in the Herald about going into golf clubs because there are basically implicit rules which people just assume, and they've just gone on for ages and nobody's ever challenged them, but it's just one of those things that is reality. So it's not it's trying not to limit those things. So your question is, we need to find the right questions which elicit the real issues, and I suppose in as far as needing to ask about all of those questions, we need to ask them.
Finished, yeah. Can I go back to the definition that you actually mentioned, and can I ask you how you actually came to compile that definition, how it was reached, and what the advisory group actually decided not to include in the definition, and why?
Those are good questions. First of all, we put that out, and it's very complex. It's a paragraph, not a sentence, which is part of illustrating just how complicated it is to get your head around all of the dimensions of this. So number one. Second of all, it's a working definition. So what we did last week, for example, or last month in Stirling, was consult with all of the stakeholders around, what they wanted to see about it, because we see this as something that is trying to pull out something that we can then work on together. So it's a common definition. What you asked us what we how we came to it and what we put into it. Yes. In some ways, you need to read it with what it is not. It is. We're trying to describe a phenomenon in relationships. Sectarianism is a reality in relationships. It's a kind of, like all of these equalities issues, it is not an it. There's not something you can pick out and say. And in this case, actually, because it's so rooted, it nearly always exists with other things, like, for example, class issues. It is differently experienced by people in different classes and different economic conditions of this community. It's also impacted on by people in different regions in different ways, because the history of the interaction of peoples has been remarkably different on this issue. It is different for each side of the Catholic-Protestant divide, if you want to use that word, but it is differently experienced on different sides of that experience, and that has become clear. So what we were trying to do was say, we know it's about attitudes, we know it's about behaviour, we know that there are legacy issues involved that come out of history, this is repeated behaviour over received normality and all of those kind of things. So we put that into the definition. We then wanted to be clear that yes, it has religious origins and that it can't be separated from those, but that it has to be expanded to include institutions which were built on that kind of assumption of difference and division, which go beyond simply faith statements but include cultural identity. And we also wanted to draw lines then between those things we talked about earlier, that anti-Catholicism is part of it, but it's not the whole story, and they need to be treated differently. Anti-Irishness likewise, and issues of the aggressive bigotry, because some people, there is a tendency, for example, to think that this is limited to the 90-minute bigotry idea, which is that it's simply something which exists for working class people in the west of Scotland. It's one end of this. And they're certainly true that at times in football matches in the west of Scotland it takes on a very aggressive face. So nobody's doubting that. On the other side, to limit it to that and to simply say that that's all that it is and it comes from nowhere else and it stops at that point is, for us, not real and does not reflect reality. So that was and I suppose out of that came a very specific and tentative type of definition. What we hope to do in the next year and a half in our work is kind of work on refining that and come back to you with kind of reporting on, well, having talked to people, we now think we can refine that better.
Thank you very much for that. Can I pass you on to Alex Johnson now?
I was just going to ask, when you were framing the definition at the outset, did you consider the broader spectrum, and did you look at other forms of religious intolerance?
Short answer is we were expressly tasked with intra-Christian sectarianism, so what the shorthand would be Catholic versus Protestant in Scotland. Many people that we talked to talked about other kinds of intolerance because, as Duncan suggests, this phenomenon bleeds into other phenomena. It bleeds into forms of racism, it bleeds into, if you like, secular faith conflicts, it bleeds into other forms of religious intolerance like Islamophobia. And all of those things were raised. So in framing the definition, we kind of tried to listen to what people were telling us and draw a wide net around it so that we tried not to exclude too many things, but then without making it so broad that it becomes meaningless. And that was exceptionally difficult because sectarianism doesn't exist in isolation. It always exists with something else, and whether that's class, or whether that's gender, or whether that's locality, or whether it's time of day, is it the weekend, is what's been happening, and it can deal with politics and with national identities, with ethnic identities. So in a sense, we had a really difficult, this is kind of what we were tasked to do. It was very difficult to get a definition that would include everything that we wanted to include, but didn't include absolutely everything. So, I would see the work on sectarianism as only part of many broader things towards equality.
It might be worth saying that part of the problem with sectarianism is actually it's either too big or too small. In other words, it's either dealt with as something which is so massive we can't deal with it, therefore we put it to the side and we don't talk to it. So it's not in an equalities framework. It's not properly into the equalities framework as one of the equalities issues which needs to be dealt with. Fact. Just like every other one. And, or it's too small. In other words, this doesn't really matter. And the other ones, and people are only talking about the other ones. I think actually success will look like being able to deal with this as one issue among others. And like within all equalities issues, there are interlocking and really quite important consequential issues that go across the board. Certainly, the experience of minorities at all levels has commonalities, and the experience of being under attack has commonalities. Yeah.
Did your experience of looking at the broader, more contemporary environment, did it bring anything to your understanding of the historic and cultural environment?
I suppose yes. If I speak for myself, I mean, just as an experiential side to this, obviously one of the things I had to be extremely personally careful about was not reading across from my own situation in Northern Ireland to here, because there was a risk, of course, that you can just use this language and one thing becomes the other, and it's not. These are distinctive phenomena, even if they're connected. But I suppose the extent to which the management of this was mostly done in an informal way rather than in a formal way, that it's something which people are very alert to in certain communities as something which is structuring reality, but which it doesn't surface up to the top, and that in many ways it has been devolved down to just people to sort out for themselves. And it's dealt with then when it turns into something which is a criminal justice question. It hits across either juvenile issues, things in prison, things through the police. And so the police are bringing you back stuff saying, you know, this is something we have to think about, when it turns into parades and it turns into football matches and it turns into youth culture and it turns into gang violence and so on. And you have traces where all of these, where sectarianism is very real. And it has the impact then of saying this is a kind of an extremism which lives in a pocket and doesn't connect to something else. So I hope that our work is about changing the culture on this now. It's actually saying it isn't about name and shame anymore. It's about saying, look, there is a phenomenon which in certain places has been inherited in how we do things. It has had and does continue to have in some cases impacts on people. These are impacts we now need to set aside, and we need people to step up to the plate. So the drive of this report in terms of its recommendations was about trying to turn this as far as possible into a matter-of-fact question which we can have some evidence around, where we can say this has been some progress, where local authorities have their own ideas of what they want to do and have programmes where they're appropriate which deal with young people or with communities appropriately, where if there are issues that are coming out of statistics which show access to goods and services are being discriminatory, they have to be dealt with as a matter of fact. If there are the churches and the football clubs and the schools and all of the various institutions which have some connection to this, that they have programmes and clear pathways through which they're interacting at their level with it. There isn't a single magic bullet issue. There is no way for us to say next week this is over. There is only a way for us to say, by people taking the bits of the responsibility that they can take and doing it now rather than not doing it, pretending it's going away or so on, then we think that is probably the most hopeful way for progress. And
leads on to the final question I was going to ask. The paragraph you've come up with, which is obviously a deeply considered definition of the problem as it exists in Scotland, do you see that as being something that will endure, or is it something that you would wish to review as time goes on?
This is absolutely a working definition, and this is absolutely... I mean, if in 10 years this is still the definition, I'll think our committee's failed, frankly. This is a considered, thank you very much for the kind words, a considered and measured starting point. But as Duncan said, you know, there are funded groups in various communities in Scotland, and we've asked them how useful is this for actually thinking about framing responses to sectarianism in their areas. And we will certainly collate that and think about that. And I would hope that this will evolve and improve. It may become tighter in some places, it may become slightly looser in others, but absolutely it's a working definition that we expect and hope will change to be more focused and tighter.
That's correct. And there is a part of that definition which I think we can get a bit of a handle on, where it says, relating which separate, exclude, discriminate against, or are violent towards. And I think if we begin to look at any evidence we have of those things, are those things still real for people? And what can we do about them? Those are legitimate areas of concern for public policy and for people in responsibility in community and public life. So those are things we can do something about.
Just returning again to what sectarian is not. The paragraph 3.8.3 is a paragraph that stands out. For those of us that take an interest in the subject, it was a very welcomed paragraph to have. And if I just read it for people, it says, sectarianism in Scotland has at times been closely associated with anti-Irish prejudice. However, the two are not identical. The religious dimension is distinctive in sectarianism. Anti-Irishness, in a cultural sense, is clearly a form of racism and should be named as such. Now, clearly, up until this point, I don't believe that that's happened, be it in legislation that we've had through Parliament or elsewhere, and I understand that your remit wasn't to look at the Offensive Behaviour Bill or any other piece of legislation that has been brought forward. At times, this paragraph, be it in the media or be it in education terms, isn't recognised, and there's a lot of groups out there that are pinning their hopes on this particular paragraph to understand the subject of sectarianism. So I was just wondering how, as parliamentarians, as this Parliament, can take this forward, because there are many, many good things in this report. It's a fantastic report for those of us that have been crying out for something like this for a long time. But that particular paragraph means a lot to certain communities, so how can we take that forward?
I think we need to recognise that racism has many forms, and racism is racism. I mean, I think that's what that paragraph is saying. One of the things we did here, and thank you for your positivity there, that's really appreciated. One of the things we did here is that sectarianism is only anti-Irish racism, and that, I think, did a great injustice to the other forms of sectarianism as there. As I understand laws on race discrimination on race, I mean, anti-Irish racism is recognised in law, and it is actionable under law, if you like, and absolutely so it should be. If we can move the debate about sectarianism on in a way that allows other forms of discrimination or interlinked forms of discrimination and prejudice to be better recognised and then better addressed, then I think that's absolutely a good thing. I'm not sure that answers your question, but
what I'm trying to get to is, if, and now we've got a clear definition, absolutely, I agree with everything you say, but if we as parliamentarians don't make that distinction and continue to see as both and talk about sectarianism in those terms, then we're not really taking the racism part of it, and therefore we are doing a disservice to everyone who experiences sectarianism as we're too weighed to one side of things. It would be my view. So it's how we curtail that, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
Actually, I suppose we said it already. This issue can't be addressed as a party political issue, because if it does so, I mean, this is something which it does draw on my own past or my own reality, is it becomes extremely difficult to have a serious conversation around it. So my view about Parliament has been, first of all, the permission to do this, and the government has given and the Parliament has allowed, is extremely important, because the leadership and the permissive environment stuff is first of all important. The second thing is, in pursuing this, I think it might be that some of the lines of the difference and the overlaps in the way that you talk about this and legislate for it and think about it could now be usefully teased out, and if we've given permission for that conversation to say this is where this is about this and this is about that, and we get a more sophisticated understanding over time through the kind of legislation, I think that's what we're trying to say here. And then thirdly, that the turning of the tanker here is that in the quality and nature and willingness to have the conversations around and to intervene on policy around this stuff, part of this is a collective, pretty much collective interest that we got here, which is that nobody said to us, if there's anything we can do, we shouldn't do it. So that's the kind of atmosphere which, if Parliament can foster that across society, that would be, we think, in 10 years' time, we might be able to come back here and say, this is something which is definitively moved on. I think that if we're looking for progress measures, I think that is, for me anyway, and we haven't put it into the report, but that's what we want to be able to say, that if a parliamentary committee sits here in 10 years' time and looks at what is the reality, we can actually say this is moved on in tone, in quality, in recognition, and in clearer definitions about what it is we're having to deal with, and that it is part of our history, but it is not something which anymore impedes relationships in Scotland.
John Mason now, please.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, I think I also was very positive reading your report, and I mean, particularly, I suppose I would agree with the point that if we've got a problem, we need to talk about it, and that applies to loads of problems that we have in society. And I suppose one of the roles for this committee is just raising issues and getting them into the public domain a little bit. To go into the kind of practicalities of where we are, I mean, I think you said you've got a year and a half to go or something like that. You have submitted this report, which I understand is to the government, so I assume we're waiting for a response from the government. But there's quite a lot in your report as well that would say things like COSLA should do this, or march and parade organisers should do that, or local authorities or Police Scotland and so on. Yeah. Can you just explain a little bit how you see this going forward in practical terms?
Well, obviously, we're an independent group, and we were established to look at how this could be done. And I suppose having decided that we don't think that this is something that should be dealt with by legislation alone. That's not to say we don't think equalities legislation is very important. It has an extremely important role in human rights legislation in ensuring these are the tones within which this happens. So it's not an anti-legislative framework. It is simply saying that that is all in place. What is really important here is that some shoulders go to the wheel, and what we eventually tease out is, where did we find it? And we identified that there were a number of levels at which action could and might be taken, and where responsibility could and might be taken. And we've tried to outline those here. And part of our work for the next year and a half, I think, is continuing to tease that out with the various stakeholders. I suppose in an ideal world, the government will make its own response. We understand, I think, by the end of the month. So at some stage, in the next few weeks, we will have a formal response to the government on those things which relate to the government.
So do you think we as a committee, or if we represent Parliament, can we just sit back and let you get on with it? Or
no, I definitely think that for the committee, it would be interesting, in as far as you have relationships with all of these bodies, to continue to press people around, you know, where they see their role in this. But obviously, for example, the relationship with local government is something we think is really important, not so much in terms of huge resources or anything of that nature, but actually in terms of getting locally relevant examples which actually make sense at the very grassroots and in real communities. With that regard, just for example, I mean, one of the most impressive projects we saw was one called Centre for Sectarianism, which works in Glasgow City Council, and where at a very small level, what they have done at one level, a small thing, is they've used Divided City, which is a novel, as a mechanism to engage primary 7, primary 6, primary 7 children, pupils in schools. And while it is superficial at one level, at another level it's had huge impact on the ability and willingness of schools to actually address this issue at primary 6, primary 7 level. The number of people who've rushed in to take that. Now, we think that it's only a very small start, but the fact that local authority leadership gave that meant that the education departments in those areas were able to take that one on a little bit. For us, it's about, we recognise this is not the same thing in some parts of Scotland as others. It's differently experienced, and so that's just one example where we'd like to see local authorities take leadership, and because it would make more sense. The police have issues which they've raised with us, which they've asked for us to look at. So, in practical terms, we would very much like to hear from all of the various stakeholders, and we will be working with them. It's not just a kind of a stand and raise your finger, though. It is a kind of thing which is, we now want to take this on. Education Scotland, you know, we'd like to see, can we develop curricular materials which can actually be helpful for people through the schools? Can we take on the question of football and make sure that the authorities are serious when this becomes a very big, dangerous thing, and so on.
If we take just local authorities, which I was particularly noted that you felt that there was room for improvement, perhaps there. I mean, you are therefore, as a group, going to be interacting with local authorities, and the government may or may not say that they will interact with local authorities. So, I mean, what I don't want is that our committee just duplicates what you are doing or somebody else is doing. So on that specific area of local authorities, I mean, do you think it would be useful if we had some local authorities came along to the committee and we asked them what they're doing, or are you going to be doing that anyway?
Well, we're only an independent committee. I mean, we don't have that public authority. If this can become an issue which is properly discussed and appropriately discussed between the Parliament and the local authorities, I personally think that would be a very useful thing, because it is about putting flesh in the bones. We can make these statements, but and this is also a longer-term activity. So we only exist for the next 15 months. So I would like to see this as a kind of the development of, if you like, and this is probably slightly overstated, a work programme which is collectively shared, in which the Parliament takes an interest in the development of anti-sectarian work, looks at the statistics and the research information that comes back, looks at the evidence that's coming up from practice, and actually talks to the relevant stakeholders on a regular basis and raises this issue appropriately, and that this gives permission for you to continue to do that. And certainly, if after we go away in 15 months, actually less than 15 months now, and nearly only a year, then this work won't be done. All that we have tried to do is tee this up, continue to raise this in the public domain, engage with all the stakeholders very actively, but it will require a leadership role, which I would love the Parliament to participate in very much.
I think if I could come back on that, I mean, sectarianism, it seems to me, has not really been focused on as an equal opportunities issue. It's not been an equalities issue. It's often been a criminal justice matter or an antisocial behaviour type matter, and it's not for us, I think, to tell this committee what to do. But if this committee felt that it should be looked at in terms of the equalities, certainly our group would very much welcome that support. Our report is calling for leadership across all parts of Scotland. In a sense, everyone in Scotland has a responsibility around this issue. It may not happen in our own lives, and Duncan was talking about his background. My interest in sectarianism is entire puzzlement. You know, as someone who was born in Caithness and grew up in Edinburgh, it kind of didn't really feature in my life, other than going to some football matches and thinking, what's this about? And one of the great enrichments of this, and I think this goes to Alex's earlier question, sort of what have we added, is an understanding that it might not impact on my life, but it impacts on other people's lives, and that to me is an equalities issue.
Even when you don't know about it.
Even when you don't know about it, you know, and it's actually about talking and listening to people and feeling, and this maybe goes to something that Siobhan was hinting at, actually hearing the hurt in some people in Scotland about the history of sectarianism. And when academics say it's not in the structures, and I'm one of those academics, it's not in the structures, it's not in life chances, that maybe ignores the kind of lived experience and the very, very real kind of visceral hurt and worry that people have. And I think that's an equalities issue, but that's up for this committee to think whether they agree with that.
Siobhan would like to come in on this as well.
Just something you said, Dr Rosie, about sectarianism shouldn't be seen as a criminal justice matter, and that was said by Dr Morrow previously. We've now got an Equalities Minister, which is very welcomed in the Parliament, in Shona Robson. However, religion is still in the Justice Department under Rosanna Cunningham. I just wondered if he had a view on that and what signal that sends to people who are working in the field of sectarianism when we say that the equality matter of sectarianism is in the Justice portfolio.
Well, I mean, it's not for us to be honest with you, to make recommendations on how these things are dealt with, and the overlaps are clear. I mean, there's not an either or on these questions, and we heard from Police Scotland and in our dealings with prisons and so on, that it does impact on the criminal justice system to some degree. However, the danger, if it's dealt with as a purely criminal justice issue, is that it is seen as something which can be tackled simply by law and by criminalisation, as opposed to by this kind of wider, broader, longer social intervention. And my own view is, and our view as a committee very much is, that unless we can move it out of just being seen as a criminal justice issue, it will continue to fester and be kind of pushed to the side. So probably it's both and, to be honest with you. It has to have a leg in each department. Certainly if it was taken over by equality and not dealt with by justice, there would be really big problems too, I have to say. So it's not something which I think is either or. It is interesting, however, that it's the Equal Opportunities Committee which seems to be the appropriate committee to deal with this. That it's dealt with, and there's discussion between those elements is inevitable.
Thank you. Christian, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Linking into this, and you were saying, you had Dr. Michael Rossi, that you were not here to tell us what to do, but I kind of disagree. I hope you can give us some ideas what we can do next, and particularly on what you just said. What do you think should be our remit? Because when I read your report, it's a fantastic report, you do put on legislation, but you don't want new legislation, or you don't want any changing on legislation. And we talk about racism, for example, Dr. Michael Rose, when you said about racism, you said that there is already for the Irish part of the sectarian debate, there are legislation already there. So I've got a feeling that you are here today at home in the Equal Opportunities Committee because you want really maybe to affect more the committees and not the legal part or the racism part.
We certainly think that this has to be monitored, and it has to be, in a sense, proactively monitored. So part of what we are trying to do is ensure that that research base is actually there. It's done, and so there's a proactive element there. There are elements in, for example, curricular development, the development of community policy. There are areas of discussion around cultural policy. There are areas of relationship with local government, all of which need to be proactively monitored. And so this is not a question of act and developed about where responsibilities should this lie, because in some senses, this is an anecdote, we really only made 2 interventions in the press in the year. And one was an interview which I did in the Glasgow Herald, in the Herald rather, in around Christmas time, which set off a firestorm around sectarianism is still the biggest civil rights issue in Scotland. So it was, you're not taking this seriously. It's really much bigger than anybody wants to take. That's what the press discussion was about. The second intervention was an interview or an article I wrote in Scotland on Sunday, after which all of the correspondence was, why are these people kicking around this issue? It's a dead issue. It doesn't really matter at all, and they're raising something which is already in the way out. The management of this up to date has been either of those poles. It's either been done in the megaphone or in silence. It's hysteria or there's nothing there. We actually, if the committees, the appropriate committees of the Scottish Parliament could integrate this into their work, that it was part of the monitoring frameworks, it was asking legitimate questions of whether it's actually in place, it was asking local government to come forward with ideas as to how they were addressing it in their local area, it was asking the various relevant parts of the police system about how they're finding this issue moving on and so on. That's, for us, what this looks like. It's a culture change and that would be led for me from the Parliament and from the atmosphere that's in the Parliament.
If I may ask again, when you I've seen the long list of groups you been here marked some funding, 4.8 million, which is quite a vast amount of money, and I hope it will make a big difference. I didn't see show the racism, the red card as a group. Do they? Now
show bigotry, the red card. Yeah, probably.
We're on it now. No, I just wanted to check. What would you like? Which key areas do you think we should be focusing on Or do you think, you talked already about local authorities, you talked about education, you talked a little bit about media. Should we be focusing on media, or should we only focus on the work in the communities?
If you're honest, it is working with communities one thing. It's education, local government, cultural and sport, and the media. And then the justice side is obviously going to be running alongside all of that as well. So if these are the kind of areas of public policy where this impacts most profoundly, and the normalisation of this as an equalities issue in Scotland is the cultural issue we're trying to do. So if you're asking me very specifically where are the areas of action, it's in education, local government, sport. The question of the media is an important question, but the how this is discussed as much as whether it's discussed, it's the how, because it tends to move from this not in the press at all to it suddenly flares up as a kind of instant around justice as well. So trying to create the subculture which turns this into something which isn't just a story to splash on the front page, but is a long story of change in Scotland, and it's slightly, and we discussed with them around that. On top of that, which is connected to the word media now, is the very difficult and vexed issue of social media, because we had quite a lot of evidence that in that space, the degree of aggression and violence that is surrounding what comes out of sectarianism and is attached, maybe starts with football but doesn't end with football, it ends in youth culture and ends up in all sorts of places, is serious and has impacts on people. But exactly what we do about that is a discussion which we haven't gone into, but we heard from the police that they are concerned about that it is this kind of open space between something they know has an impact, but actually how you intervene without doing damage is also complicated. So there are issues to be thought of around that.
There's always a risk, if I may say, when you say what you give us a Christmas, you'll give us a Christmas list of what you want to do. But I think Duncan talked earlier about difference and hostility. I mean, to me, difference is good. Difference is what makes life in our society vibrant and interesting. But sometimes people can react to difference with hostility. The hostility, I think, is the criminal justice end. It's when people misbehave or break the law or discriminate against someone. And to me, that's kind of, we have the framework for that. What I guess I would, and this is a sort of personal statement, what I guess I would really like is more work done on celebrating difference. That, we come from all kinds of parts of the world, we have all kinds of different views, sometimes we'll disagree, but that's fine. And that might be something that the sort of Equal Opportunities Committee might be more suited to sort of pursuing that kind of line.
There's this element of equality and human rights work which is very underdeveloped, but which we know instinctively is very important, and it goes around to this name, good relations. And it's very poorly developed as it currently stands, because it's quite hard to get a kind of legal handle on. And nevertheless, the development of a strategy which is able to deal with those kind of things on the ground, in real life, what does a good relations actually mean? It doesn't mean that people don't have disagreements, it means that the disagreements they have are done properly. But that there are, that it is around kind of the development of common citizenship and so on. Now, all of that's very vague, but there is within some of the legislation a recognition that that simple, hard-edged legislation is not focus enough on the kind of outcomes we want to see, and that they need to be set in that context where they are connected to each other. So there's also an area of work which is monitoring, or at least engaging with, the sense in which this has ceased to be something which people are frightened of or scared of, or is having a negative effect on real people's lives, to this is something which is about difference, and yes, we have it, and it's one of those aspects which makes life interesting in Scotland.
Thank you. Yeah. Can I go back to, as well, education? In page 10 of your report, you actually say, we don't believe that sectarianism stems from or is the responsibility of denominational schools or specifically Catholic schools, nor that sectarianism would be eradicated by closing such institutions. And also on page 30, 6.4, 4.4, you then talk about the shared campuses and forging links and strong partnerships with the community as well. Can you actually elaborate on that and tell us what you actually found?
I'll start and then Michael can continue with this one. This is another of these issues which if you mention it, people go to one end or the other, and so it's also been one of those issues which people don't like to raise, because you end up in a conversation which is particularly not constructive. It's either yes or no on Catholic schools. Eventually that's what it turns into. We took the view that actually, first of all, the responsibility for this isn't with any institution, certainly not with Catholic schools. It's not with a particular group here, and anything which starts from that perspective is unhelpful and wrong. Second of all, that it's not just to do with schools, it's right across the board. This is, you know, if you're going to shut one institution, then you'd have to shut down all sorts of other institutions which have nothing to do with schools. But so that's number two. Number three, that some of the good schools have made very good contributions towards good citizenship and how people actually relate to other people, and are very successful in doing so and have made important contributions there. So our view was that rather than focus on anything which says to shut these schools, is can we encourage people within the schools of whatever kind they are to take sectarianism as a reality and develop creative mechanisms which actually engage with this. So the key question isn't what kind of school it is, what are you doing in relation to the sectarianism which you're experiencing? And actually we found good practice examples in a number of places which we thought we should encourage, both where teachers were leading extremely innovative programmes for their kids which were systematic, and we'd like to see those developed on. We'd like to see greater support in the curriculum for people to actually talk about this but engage with this. The shared campus schools are an opportunity for everybody to kind of move past the sense of total splendid isolation and begin to see these as more normal experiences. But even where there are not shared campuses, so there are possibilities built into the ways in which the schools operate, which address the impacts at one level inside the school, but also, and talk about it, but also perhaps develop interesting curricular initiatives and real initiatives which are supported from outside the community. So our view was that it's in that kind of flexibility, it's in that kind of creativity, it's in that kind of responsibility taking that sectarianism is attacked, not in whether you open a school or shut a school, because whichever type of school you have can make a contribution in this area and must do. And aggressive either closing of other people's schools, which they think are very important, will certainly be experienced within that group as an attack on something which people don't understand. And on the other side, the failure to really be honest about some of the issues which children are facing will also, if that's what's happening, is legitimately confronted as, you know, something we have to tackle. So this was something we wanted to take very, very clearly head on, which was this isn't going to be solved by just shutting schools and forcing people into here. This has to be solved by people taking this issue seriously and developing practical and real steps which they can take to address the issues which people are facing and to create new relationships.
I think the issue of schools is an incredibly complex, sensitive one. I think it draws together the issues we've been discussing about difference and hostility. That some people fear that difference because they think it leads to hostility, or some people regard any wish to change that difference as an attack and therefore hostile. And certainly I find that, you know, this is the one that you light the touch paper and you run away because people rush often to very defensive positions. It's also, it seems to me, for some people who perceive sectarianism as a problem, but don't necessarily, or are told it's a problem, but don't necessarily experience it in their own lives. There's a sense in which they're looking for a culprit. There's a kind of Duncan talks about a silver bullet, I talk about who done it. Sort of shows the different kind of TV shows we watch, I think. That, you know, who's responsible? You know, here we have this thing, this bad thing, sectarian. Who or what is responsible for it? And I think many people will point at Catholic schools in Scotland as, an institutional sense of difference, and therefore worry about that. And I think we really wanted to say that you could get rid of the denominational school system now, and it probably wouldn't make one iota of difference to actually what sectarianism is. I think there is a debate to be had on how we organise religion, schools in this country. I think the idea of schools, Duncan used the phrase there, in splendid isolation. We shouldn't have schools, any kind of school, in splendid isolation. Schools belong to the communities that were then, and regardless of whether they're denominational or non-denominational schools, we should be encouraging to be coming together and working together in areas. I don't think we can have a debate on schools at the moment because, in a sense, it's too sensitive, that people will rush to defend their positions, some of which can be seen as attacking other positions. And what I would really like, if a report can in some way contribute to people talking about these things, disagreeing's fine, difference is great, but actually being able to talk and often explain why they have the position they have, then we maybe collectively can get to, well, actually that position is quite poorly informed. This is the reason that we do things this way, this is the reason that we feel uncomfortable, and we can move to a sense that we can have difference without the hostility. I think education is an absolute sort of, I was going to say blue touch paper, but when you work in this, you've got to be very careful about what colours you choose. So a beige touch paper that can be lit.
Yes, I mean, the sense, it would be great if there was a scapegoat. If you could find somebody who's responsible for this, it would be great in some sense, because then you could get rid of it like that. It's not going to work like that. It is about, these relationships are out of our history. We're going to have to move to tackle them. There is a willingness and an appetite, I think, for people to say, where this exists is now not appropriate in the 20th century, 21st century even. But that we have to, that in schools, it's a subtle position, I suppose, we've taken. We actually think there's lots schools can do. It's just not focused on saying, shut this or open that school. Where we have opportunities, we need to start taking them and we start building on them. So if the message that needs to go out from us is, we think this is an area, a really fruitful area where we could begin to change things, and engagement with Education Scotland and with the school providers would be something we would like to see how could you maximise that. And one of the things that we have tried to support is youth intervention, not because we believe young people are the problem either, but because we need developments of models. A lot of this is around how could you do this rather than whether you want it done. And actually the reason for the money is, over the 3-year period, is to try to, and we've put in as best as possible evaluation and support mechanisms and places where we can have a long legacy of this, is really, can we develop tools, examples of best practice which actually can then be built on and can make a difference over time. So that's the big legacy. And in the area of schools and young people, there are so many creative things that could be done and actually are being done in some places, and it's about building on that.
Would you say an example of possible good practice would be that when councils are considering rebuilding the schools, that they look at the shared campus model then wherever possible to help to start breaking down those barriers as well with the community and with the children?
I suppose the question of, certainly, that at every point in education departments that people think, well, in as far as there's sectarianism, and that would be also a local wider issue, can we ensure that the way we do our schools policy also engages with that? Now, whether that in any given setting is this shared campus, I think there is a danger. It's a bit like saying the principle is we have to tackle sectarianism. The way you then do that out, if we get overly prescriptive about that, then we get into all this danger. But I would like the school authorities and the education departments to be able to say with more specificity, this is what we're doing, and be able to point to it, so that it's not just a kind of general we're against it, or us saying you must have a shared campus where it doesn't actually work, but it is actually about saying you need to be able to demonstrate to us within the life of a child between 4 or 5 and 18 that where the interventions happen and how this child is not going to end up at 18 in some sense, that is a them and us in this local community. And I think that is, if we can begin to trace that and make that an obligation of those who are responsible for education and for thinking about the care of children, then that would be a huge, huge way forward.
I think my starting point would be that what are the shared campuses are one possible thing that local authorities could do, but what is the purpose of that? If the purpose is simply to save money or to share playing fields at different times of the day, then really, I think that's not a great way forward. I think the principle of getting children in different schools from different social backgrounds, and I'm not talking about denominational and non-denominational, I'm talking about schools, to mix together, to do things together, and to understand that Scotland is made up of very different kinds of people would be a good thing. And there's some wonderful work. I mean, just to sort of have a good story, Duncan mentioned sensible sectarianism. There's great work with the Citizens Theatre around Divided City. There's great work in Inverclyde in getting kids from different backgrounds together to do stuff, to do fun stuff, and actually learning from each other. If shared campuses can contribute to that, then that's a good thing. But it should be about a contribution to that broader idea of bringing people together and getting towards that celebration of difference being a good thing, not something that we should be worried about.
We're actually quite tight for time now. And Christian's got a question, if you could make it short.
Yeah, just on a particular issue of share competencies, and if I understand your way of thinking, share competencies will be a good thing, but you don't want to do them for that reason. Yes. And is it to be applied on everything else, but we don't want to highlight that there is only them and us, but we want to try to dissipate this idea that there are only two camps in society, whatever society you are in?
I mean, I think I would actually start by saying there are many potential camps in society, not just around religion, but certainly around class. I mean, our schools are segregated by class, not just in the sense that some are private and some are state schools, but that they're by residence, and we know that we live in a country in which people are segregated by their social class background. I would just want to see lots and lots more mixing by schools, full stop. Shared campuses might be one way to do that, but they are not the only way, and indeed sometimes they're not the best way.
And it would be the wrong thing to do it just for that reason.
It wouldn't necessarily be. I think just to have a shared campus and leave it at that, to say, right, okay, here's the school, this side is whatever. There is much more than that, and shared campuses is one way to facilitate the broader thing. Just doing it doesn't facilitate the broader issue.
And I realise you're tight for time. It is almost, we think this is a hugely innovative and important innovation. To turn it into the thing everybody should do all the time is probably a mistake, but at the same time we need to maximise the opportunities which are there, and if it does become something which can become a model and a lead, then let's do it.
I mean, I was coming from the point of view that I actually went out to a primary school who had a shared campus, and at playtime they all came together, and they came together for other reasons as well, which I thought was an excellent model.
Leadership in the schools could be decisive in that, actually. Leadership in the schools could be really decisive.
Thank you very much for a very interesting morning, and for a very interesting report as well. Thank you very much. This now actually concludes the public part of today's meeting, and our next meeting will take place on Thursday the 6th of March and will include oral evidence on our inquiry into fathers in parenting. And I'll now suspend the meeting to allow the room to clear before we move into private session.